Today we're starting a new topic, moving into airports, so that'll be kind of a nice, I guess, change from what we've been doing, all looking at cars and automobile transportation, or are primarily looking at that. Our travel demand modeling does cover all modes, and so we looked at some of those other modes as well. And again, most transportation in the United States, roughly 90% of transportation movements within the U.S. are accomplished by automobile. So that's one reason we focus so much on that. And that's probably going to be a large portion of what your future jobs will be. If you're in the transportation sector, it's going to be dealing with cars and how to handle that, design and modeling car transportation, at least for the foreseeable future. But airports is an important piece as well, and longer trips, obviously. Most of our longer trips are done by air travel, and so that's why we're focusing now next 3 lectures on airports. We do have a section coming up on railroads, so we'll be trying to cover the major motions, major movements systems we have here in the U.S. Do that. Let's start off with a little news just to kind of get us in the mood for airports. So O'Hare Airport expansion has been in the news a lot over the last 3 years or so. They've got 2 projects going on. One was a revamping of their runways and expansions, and actually they decommissioned some runways and added others, or lengthened them through this new project they've got coming up. They've also, probably more recently in the last year and a half, they had a competition for a new terminal, Terminal 2 being replaced. They're going to call it the Global Terminal, I believe. And so that's been catching a lot of the news too. Now, the runway piece was already ongoing, and they'd had ideas or plans for some time to expand the terminal access as well. O'Hare, many of you have flown through there. It's a little bit cramped, right, in the terminals. It's an older airport. By old meaning from the late 60s is when a lot of it was built. It's been remodeled a number of times, and probably about every 20 years they do a major remodel there. But it's limited, right? And the air travel had continued to grow until recently. It's continued to grow substantially each year, and that's been, things reach their capacity. Right, and we need to replace them. And same with roads and bridges and everything else. Same with airports. Right, they've reached their capacity and expanded. So that's been catching a lot more of the interest lately. Is that new terminal that's coming up, and they had a design competition with architects looking at that. So the runway piece, though, we'll start with that. Is they've got a new runway expansion. They've got a new runway down here. You can see in kind of this reddish color down there. That's a new runway they've got. They've also taken away some of the older runways they had in use that were conflicting with their current operations. And so the idea is, if you build one more runway on an east-west configuration, which is their primary landing and takeoff configuration for it, that would add enough capacity that would allow O'Hare to have more flights yet. And it's a good thing for business in that area, because it increases demand for hotels and restaurants and accommodations near that, and also transportation uses around it. 20 years ago, there was a big push for a 3rd Chicago airport. The O'Hare and Midway were at capacity or close to capacity, and so they were looking for a new place. And the problem is that it's built up so much around Chicago in the suburbs that there are no open spaces for a new airport very close to the city center. So you'd have to be a long way out. Gary made a strong push to become the 3rd Chicago airport, and I think even have branded themselves that to a degree, and spent some money to expand their capacity, but it never, I guess the pun here, never took off, right? And the Gary Airport never became a heavy passenger hub, I guess to say. They may still have freight flights in and out of there, but it never became that 3rd Chicago airport. And what occurred then is, after the search and the look for a new spot, is they've reinvested in O'Hare, basically. And so they found that, hey, we could squeeze more capacity out of this area we've already got, right? And O'Hare is early issue, why they didn't consider it is just expanding it earlier, was that it's landlocked now. It's completely surrounded by development on all sides. It had no more space to really add a lot more capacity than what it already had. Well, by reconfiguring the runways, they were able to get more capacity out of it. And they had a number of crossing runways before, and we're going to talk about why you would want that as we go through this lecture today. But that's how it started. That's where they got with O'Hare and working through. And one of the issues in this article was one of the reasons expanding airports is contentious is because if it is surrounded now by residential areas, it's the noise issue, right? And the airports say, well, we were here first, you knew you were building near an airport. Why are you complaining about noise? Residents don't care. It's loud. They're going to complain. That's what they're looking at. So O'Hare used to have a bunch of cross runways within it. So you can see these diagonal ones through there, and they would land more aircraft on those runways. And that would be this, it had a noise envelope like this blue. So underneath the flight path of the planes is where most of the noise is. So that would be your noise contour. This is, I don't know what decibel rating they're looking at, but that's the contour of where that you would reach those decibels of noise through that. Well, by reconfiguring it and by adding this new runway in, this great big one in here, and landing more airplanes on east-west route through it, which did increase their capacity. The new contour is this red line, right? And so you can see some of these places used to be had noise here. Now the people living underneath these red contours are going to get more noise, and those are the people who are complaining. Yeah. And and you would think that you'd also get people voting for the change from people who used to live under the old noise contour and won't have it anymore. But I guess that didn't really happen. Right? So that was an issue with this new plan. But the plan's going ahead. The runway's going to be open in 2020. They've moved ahead with this. So they passed all the environmental reporting needed, and got their permit, EPA permit approved, so they could go ahead and expand these. So that's what's going on there. So that's a big issue, and that will add quite a bit of capacity to O'Hare. So O'Hare can go back up in that. And then the other piece of this is they are going to do new terminals, and so they've actually are expanding two terminals, Terminal 2 and 5. 2 is going to become the new global terminal, and it's going to go from 5.5 million square feet to 8.9 million square feet in the new terminal. And this is the terminal that was selected, the design competition. This is a rendering from the architectural firm that was competing to get this new contract to do this terminal, and it's going to be this will be the new terminal. It's got satellite terminals out in as well. So you need enough runways to land the planes, right, coming in, but you also need enough gate space to park the planes and to load and unload passengers. And both things were problems at O'Hare, that they didn't have enough of both landing and takeoff capacity on the runways, and they didn't have enough gates. Well, they probably have enough gates now to handle what can land there, but as they expand this, they're going to need more gates to handle the increased traffic. So that's coming up. That's an $8.5 billion expansion. It's a lot of money, right? It's a lot of money. There's a lot of money in airports, right? That is the primary mode of long-distance travel in the U.S., so that's where all the money goes for that. So it's hard to imagine 900,000 flights, right? That's a lot coming through there. So that's O'Hare coming up, and that gets us thinking about airports. And if you remember back in the days when we could fly, how the airports work, right? When you get to the airport, what is your process, right? You're parking, you're getting dropped off by transit, you're moving through the terminal, you go through security, you go to your gate, and then you load and you fly out. And so just keep that in mind, that process of how we move people through airports or back and forth through airports through that. There are a lot of airports in the U.S., more than I would have thought, right? We've got 13,000 roughly airports in the U.S. A lot of those are just small private ones, right? I mean, I know out here, I live in the countryside. There's 2 or 3 people around here who have, quote, their own airport, which is just a grass strip out in the field. But that can be listed, but it's a private facility. It's not open to the public. And so these small little airports, there are a bunch of them around, and you can find them, and they're mapped. They're quite often mapped through the FAA keeps track of all of this, all right, for that. And what they out of that 13,000, the 3,400 are considered significant to air transportation, and those are ones that are more likely to have. They're not all, but they're more likely to have passenger facilities. So for public passengers through there, not all do. Some are just freight, mostly all freight through there, but it's still considered significant for air transportation. And those are eligible to receive federal money for airport improvements. And so that's AIP. They've got 3,200 airports are on that AIP list, 10 heliports, and 38 seaplane bases. Didn't know seaplanes were still a thing, but yeah, I guess they are. Particularly in I would guess like in the Florida Keys, it's more likely, but also up around Alaska. There's a lot of seaplane bases up there just because there are very few roads once you're out of the main populated areas of Alaska, which aren't very many, right? So it's Anchorage and Juneau, but Juneau doesn't actually have any roads going to it. You can only get there by boat or by plane coming in. And then in Anchorage is more of a traditional city, I guess, and has a number of roads. But once you're outside of that area and up, to and from Denali, probably, almost all of Alaska is covered by air, right? So they have these isolated communities, very small villages out scattered across Alaska. The only way to get there is by air. And then along the coast, you get barges in the summer will bring up products, but then during the winter, there's no other access, right? They actually don't have roads going to any of those villages along there. It's all by airplane, and that would be where I could think some of these seaplane bases are for that, because that's an easy place to land, right? Especially if you're near the coast, right? So you can land. And if you're inland, then you have those bush planes that'll come in and land with the great big tires on them for that. So that's an interesting piece there on that. Here's a map of where all these airports are, and these are the 332 ones that are considered important. Right. So remember, there's a lot more smaller ones we don't show, and you can see there are quite a few scattered all across Alaska, through here and out through the island chains, through that, and generally they follow where the population is the densest, right? So it's not just that the East Coast once likes airplanes, it's just that's where more people live, so there's more airports, right? And it's like most of these maps we've got. Pretty much anything you track is going to look similar to this because that's where the populations are. That's where they map up through that, right? And so here's their list of primary airports, and these are ones that handle passenger traffic, and these are the ones you can fly into and out of on passenger traffic, or have a very significant they do have a very significant service they provide to a local community. Could be freight, could be something else. Like up here, these must be the airport up by the oil fields in northern Alaska, right? And so that's probably not a tourist destination. That's probably servicing, all of the oil companies who have drilling up there in the Arctic from that. And like I said, we just talked about Alaska, air travel is one of their main modes to get between communities. Right? There are no roads from Anchorage out to any of these places. Right? There is one road that goes up to the oil fields, and that's about it through Alaska. And so in the winter, either snowmobile or airport is your only way you're going to move around through that. So these are the maps, and you can probably pick out which major cities these things are. The stars are the really large hubs, and so the Indianapolis airport's one, Midway and O'Hare are both. Milwaukee's got a hub. Minneapolis, St. Paul is a hub, so forth. Denver, Salt Lake City, and so forth and so forth. And Albuquerque, Phoenix, so you can pick them out. And again, there's more where there's higher population. So those are the big airports. In Indiana, this is what we've got. We only have one real hub, which is Indianapolis. So any of you who live downstate or a little closer to mid-center state, probably fly through Indy more likely. Through that. From Valparaiso, it's obviously easier to get up to Chicago and fly through one of those two airports out of that. Right. And the Valparaiso Airport, Porter County Airport, is considered a national or regional important airport. There's a lot of light aircraft traffic coming in and out of Valparaiso because it's, this is a fairly populated area in the region here. And, this is Gary, which thought was going to become the next third Chicago airport, never did through that. So then Valparaiso, for a lot of light aircraft and private pilots, this is a really popular airport near us through there. South Bend and Fort Wayne also have passenger traffic, and so they're considered a small non-hub airport, and they're a feeder hub or feeder airport that goes into hubs. South Bend, you can fly to O'Hare, Detroit, Atlanta, and you can get some direct flights like an Allegiant down to Florida and Vegas from there, but those are not every day of the week for that. And Cleveland and Minneapolis all have direct daily connections, or did have daily connections to South Bend. And same with Fort Wayne. They pretty much cover the same hubs from that. And Evansville's also got passenger traffic coming in and out of it as well. So that's the Indiana layout of what it looks like. We can also look at, here's Georgia, right? So the airport you're probably familiar with is Atlanta, right? It's the busiest airport in the world. Atlanta Hartsfield Airport is the busiest in the world. It trades off back and forth with O'Hare. O'Hare in the 80s was the biggest, but then it kind of got limited by its size, like we just talked about. Right? And Atlanta took over as the largest. I think O'Hare has gotten close again. It's coming back with more flights coming in. I'm not sure that's something you want. You want to be the busiest airport, right? That just probably means it's a more pain in the rear to get through it, right? So maybe you don't want to be the biggest, but apparently they do, because they was commenting on which is the biggest through there. And we can see the difference here. And here's the primary airport is Atlanta, right? It is the biggest in the world. 45 million enplanements. That's how many people get on a plane. So that's how they track. By passenger traffic, that's how you track it. So there's 45 million enplanements at Hartsfield Jackson International Airport. At the regional ones around it, at the Fulton County Airport, Charlie Brown Field, is it's a regional one, so it's R. It's only got 725 people per year got on planes there and flew somewhere, right? There's a lot more people flying for private aircraft, but as far as picking, and it's probably charter, these are the number of people who came in and got on a chartered flight through there. It could be like little Lear jets or business jets or something. Who knows? Right. And then down to Lawrenceville, LZU, right here, there's 16. Right, that's pretty small. That's pretty small enplanements. And these are public passengers, is what we're looking at in enplanements there. So let's give you an idea. All of these are on the map. These are all considered inside of the national airport system. There's a huge difference in size, right? And we probably only know the big ones. We only know Atlanta. We didn't know about these other three, right? Very unlikely we're ever going to fly to those through that. And then this is Indiana. This is how these are airports within the system in Indiana, in the larger ones through this. And here you can see all the number of enplanements through that. Or actually, this is operations. This is the number of takeoffs and landings, the number of operations, not enplanements for that. And broken down by the different airports within Indiana. Right. And the Porter County one didn't make it on this list. It wasn't in the high enough range to hit it. Here's Evansville, here's Fort Wayne, here's Indianapolis, here's South Bend. Right. So as far as air carrier, this is Delta, American, United, that kind of air carrier. Total operations in Indianapolis is by far the biggest. And if you've been to the Indianapolis airport, you know it's much bigger than the Fort Wayne and South Bend airport. I've never been to Evansville, but I know it's much bigger than Fort Wayne and South Bend. Here's the Gary one, right? There's only 401 air carrier operations. The supposed third Chicago airport is still running way behind South Bend and Evansville and Fort Wayne, right, on enplanements. So sorry, Gary. And and so Fort Wayne would be the second largest, and then South Bend, then Evansville after Indianapolis, right? Total employments, right? And so that's air carrier. Here's air taxi. I'm not sure what air taxi means exactly. I think that may be more, again, if that charter flights, that would be considered air taxi, right? So this would be corporate services, bringing people in and out. Fort Wayne does pretty good. Indianapolis has even more. In Evansville and South Bend has 15,000, right? South Bend has a lot of business jet activity, and if you've ever been there on a Notre Dame game weekend, the South Bend airport is parked full of private jets out there on the tarmac, because people, I guess, have some money who come to see the Notre Dame games, and they bring their personal jets or they charter one through that. So I don't know if that's a little bit of that action there. General aviation or private pilots, these are people who want to just who have their own airplanes or who rent one and want to fly on their own. That's general aviation through there. And it could be commercial activities too, air mapping and stuff like that going on, but not hauling passengers. I think that's these two groups through that, unless they're personal friends or guests or something. And you can see the list here. Indianapolis has some. You can see the general aviation ones do not match where the busier public ones are. And then look at Lafayette. The Lafayette Airport has 43,000. It is the busiest general aviation airport in Indiana. So it seems a little weird, right? Here's military. There's not a lot of those. And these are total operations, right, through that. And these are longer distant ones. These are itinerant and versus local pieces, civil flights, military flights, and total flights through that, right? And then here's total operations, right? And so Lafayette is the second busiest airport in the state after Indianapolis of total operations, which is aircraft taking off and landing, right? And so what's going on in Lafayette? It didn't have that. It's got very few air carrier aircraft coming in. It doesn't have very many air taxis, but then all of a sudden it's got tons of general aviation and civil local operations. What's going on with Lafayette? Well, this is where Purdue teaches their flying school. So there are planes taking a little Cessnas all day long, just taking off and landing at Lafayette, because this is actually right next to Purdue. The Lafayette Airport is actually on the west side of the Purdue campus. So that is skewed heavily by students learning to fly. Right, so it's kind of interesting that makes it the second busiest. If you look at it by operations, the second busiest airport in Indiana through there. Here's the Valparaiso report, and so you can look this up. Again, the FAA controls all of these airports and lists them and all that. The FAA does a pretty good job in keeping their statistics, so you can find out all this information about any of the airports in the country, particularly in the state as well through there. And so you can see we've got 154 aircraft based at this field, which is ones that are in hangars there or are based out of that. Total aircraft, 136 of those are single engine airplanes, a few multi-engine, right? So these are the Cessnas. These are like a Bonanza with a dual engine plane. Only 7 are jets, right? Not very many of those. 2 helicopters and 1 ultralight are based there. And I don't know how often they update these statistics, but that's what has been listed for that airport. I guess as they update them once a year through that. About 191 operations a day, which is takeoffs and landings. That's pretty reasonable, right? And from campus, if we were on campus, you could tell there are quite a few planes that fly over and come. This is fairly busy for a small town. It's a fairly busy airport through there. Again, being on the edge of the Chicago region, people like to come out there to do private flying because it's less congested and easier to get spots and probably cheaper to rent. From there, but I would definitely not want to be flying a private plane like out of Midway, competing with all that traffic, right, through there. And here's a bunch of details. We're going to talk about that later. This is stuff you'd want to know if you were a pilot. You want to know the exact latitude and longitude. You want to know the elevation of the ground that you're going to land on, so you can set your altimeter and so forth, so that you can know what what you're aiming for, and all this is fairly automatic these days with GPS systems, but still. And this is the listing. It used to be you'd had a big book of these, and so if you were going to fly across country, you'd look it up and you'd know where you're head and so forth if you had to navigate yourself and come in right through there. Here's the runway heading, so you know where to line up when you come in. You know which runways they've got. We've actually got two out there. This is the main one, is on 92 magnetic bearing right through that. So here's the airport ownership and use. There's 19,000 total. There were 5,000 of those, more or less, are open to the public. 13,000 are closed to the public. So that's a lot of private airfields, right? Again, out of that 19,000, before we said there was only, so many thousand that were on the list of nationally important ones. And so that's much less than the total number of airports we've got. Of the ones that are open to the public, there's 1,100 that are privately owned and 4,000 that are publicly owned. All right, who owns the airports in Chicago? That's the city of Chicago. They have their own bureau that is in charge of the airports there. The Valparaiso Airport's owned by Porter County, so it's a publicly owned airport. A much smaller one, but it's also publicly owned. Indianapolis, I'm not sure who owns the Indianapolis airport. I'm assuming it's the city, but sometimes they have an airport authority. So in South Bend, they have an airport authority that is in charge of the airport there. It's not directly owned by the city. Probably some connection to them, but it's not directly owned by them. When looking at the airports system, we have two terms we're going to talk about, and that's the land side and the air side. And the difference is once you walk out of the building and head down the gate, down the ramp, I guess, in the jetway into the airplane, that's when you've crossed over. You've crossed that boundary between the land side and the air side. And both things are important. Both things are very important on the civil engineering piece, right? And that's why we're looking at them is, right, there is a lot of transportation need on the land side, getting people to the airport and then getting people into and through the airport once they've parked or gotten dropped off. Or however they arrived at the airport. So and just think about it, your experience is flying. Think of all that infrastructure on the land side, right? There's parking garages, O'Hare, there's the CTA line, well, Midway as well. There's CTA lines coming in. There's an entire train station there for that land side. There's all of the tunnels and the escalators and all that getting people into the airport and where they're going. And then through the airport, right, so we've got parking, we've got drop-off areas, and you've got the terminal building, right? There's a lot going on just in the terminal building, and that's a whole nother piece of passenger design, right, and moving people is how do you get them through the terminal building. And after 9/11, when we had to revamp all of the security systems right through there, a lot of these older terminal buildings, and like at O'Hare, it really put a cramp on their style. They lost a lot of space being taken up by all the TSA screenings, the additional screenings, and you changed a lot of the flow. Midway had just been rebuilt in the 90s, I think, and in the old days you could walk down to the gate with your friends before they took off, and so all the restaurants were on the other side of the gate. Of the TSA security screening thing. Because if they didn't have enough space, they would just put them down there because then everybody can eat there and do whatever. Well, after 9/11, they closed all that off. You have to be ticketed only. Only ticketed passengers can go down to the gate. After that, you may not have realized that used to be the case. And so that changes. Now, as a visitor, if you're just picking someone up or dropping them off at Midway, right, there were no restaurants outside the secure zone, right? And so that completely changed how we designed terminal buildings, and it really hurt the older buildings. That space wasn't allowed for, right? That's a lot more space that wasn't accounted for, and it changed how people used the building, and it hurt or helped, whatever. Those pieces in there. Indianapolis is a much newer airport, right? It was only finished, 10 years ago? The new terminal? Maybe 15. It's fairly new, but it was after that time. And so they've got a really big shopping area, and it's like a central atrium right when you come in and on before you go just through security. So people dropping you off or picking you up can wait and eat and and all that. And then after you go through security, there's another set of restaurants and services down in the waiting areas near the ramps and the gates through that. So that's very different how that was. So that's all right. Got off on a tangent there. Then on the outside of the building, basically on the outside of the terminal building, is now the air side, we call it. And that's all about there shouldn't be any pedestrians out there. There's a lot of baggage handling, right? There's still a lot of that going on in the gate area, but it's mostly aircraft operations, right? You've got ramps, which is where the airplanes are parked. They call those ramps. Then you've got the taxiways, which get you out to the runways, and then you've got the runway, and then then airspace after that, right? So that is the aircraft operations. You come out, you wait. Remember, the pilots will come on and say, well, we're number 3 in line to take off, right? You're in a holding area. You're down at the end of the runway getting ready to take off. And then you go in order, and then you hit the runway, you take off, and then you leave, and then you're en route, right? And so you're in the airspace, and then we're going to talk about airspace too as we come through. As you land, you hit the runway, you get on a taxiway, you come up to the taxiway system, and then you finally park at a gate. And you're on a ramp, as they call it, and then you unload. So there's a lot to do with the design of that, which is, kind of like designing roads, but for much larger things that behave much differently than cars, right? When they're on the ground through that. So that's the airside piece of what we're going to be going through, right? So let's say you get hired to do an airport. Let's look at the air side of it of an airport. What are you going to consider, right? We're talking about runways for now, so you want to lay out runways. What would you take into account? Okay. What would inform your decision about how you want to design this runway? This is normally where I'd ask the class and you guys would respond, but that's not going to happen. So I'm going to move forward and say, here are some things I think you should think about is how big are the airplanes coming in, right? Lafayette Airport has a ton of takeoffs and landings, but they're all little planes. They have a few big ones, but they're mostly all small planes. Whereas O'Hare, you can imagine, is mostly all large planes. Right, and the biggest possible planes are coming into O'Hare, right? The A380, 747s, those are all using O'Hare, and so you have to design for that. So Porter County Airport over here in Valparaiso, you do not have to worry about a 747 landing there. Well, if one ever tried, you'd be really worried because it's not going to make it. It'll run out of runway before it can stop, and it definitely can never take off. You need much more distance for takeoff. And the pavement, I don't even know if that runway's wide enough to handle the landing gear on a 747. Maybe just barely, but it better be a pretty good pilot. All right, there's no room for error coming down, and he'll break the pavement because that thing is not going to handle that weight of the 747, which we'll see here in a second. All right, so what are you expecting? What kind of airplanes and performance? FAA has a list of groups, group 1 through 6, I think it is, and based on size, right? So maybe you're only going to design up to a group 3, so that's like mid-range size planes. Group 5 would be like a 777 and like a A330 and so forth. Those are, I think, group 5. Group 6 is the A380, so even larger, right, through there. Another thing, and how many are you going to expect each day, right? So if you don't expect very many planes of whatever size, you only need one runway. Small airports only have one, right, through there. Valparaiso's got 2. South Bend only has 2, but they're bigger. They're much bigger than the Porter County one, right? And then you get to O'Hare, where I think there was like 6 or 7 right on that map through there. So that's important. Another one you may not have thought of, since we've been looking at cars before this, is what direction is the wind out of. That makes a huge difference on aircraft operations. And how you orient your runway is going to be dependent to a degree on where the wind is primarily coming from, right? If your wind is always out of the south, you probably want a runway aimed south because that'll help you want to land and take off into the wind because that helps the airplane get lift faster, right, through there. And it's much safer for them too. What's the altitude of the airport, right? If you're building in Colorado and you're at a high altitude, there's a lot less lift because the air is less dense there, so you're going to need longer runways for safe aircraft operation. Right? If you're at sea level in the tropics, you have a ton of lift because that's a very dense, heavy air. It's and that'll make a difference through that. And actually, well, cold air is denser than warm air too. So if it's if you can be at the equator and be cold, that would be your densest environment. Well, actually, the equator doesn't matter. If you're at sea level and very cold, that's pretty dense air, and so you can get higher lift through that. You won't need as much runway for that. And then what's the expected temperatures? Again, that's going to affect the density of the air. And again, in the tropics, you're going to get less lift. In the colder climate, you're going to get more lift because you have denser air for that. All right, so that's all of it, which are kind of unique things we wouldn't have thought about when we were just looking at automobiles and highway design stuff, right? Here it is, the groups. So it is 6. So they have 6 airplane groups. Here's the general size of what kind of airplanes fit into that group. And here's some examples. All right, so a 737, which is a fairly small passenger plane, and an A321 from Airbus, they're only in a group 3. Right, and so they can service smaller airports. It's only group 3. 757s and probably 767s are in group 4, so they're kind of in that mid-range. And then 747s and A340, which there's not too many of them left anymore. A350s, which are the newer version of that, and longer distance, are in that group 5. And 777s. So these are your famous international route type airplanes servicing the international routes. Those are group 5 and much bigger planes for that. And an A380 is kind of by itself these days over here in group 6. Now the new 777 has a folding wingtips. I don't know which they counted in wingspan. If it wasn't folded, it'd be in this wingspan. And if it is folded, I don't know if it's in this wingspan. It's something like that. Through there. So that's their groupings, and so that's what size of plane are you going to design for. You're going to do it by group, right? And they'll list it. This airport can only handle up to group 3, and so you can't bring your 757 there because it's a group 4, right? Plane. Right. Here's the difference in the runway pieces off of that. All right, so this is based on this design group. Now this is giving you an idea of how big you need to design your facility. Right, what's your runway width? Right, if up through group 3 they should be 100 feet wide. I didn't know they were that wide. That's pretty wide. What's a road? The road's only probably 24 feet wide. A runway's 100. Once you're up to group 4, you got to go to 150 feet, and then if you're going to group 6, it's 200 feet wide. That is wide, right? That's that's a lot for that. You have runway shoulders. Didn't know that either, right? So those will depend. So not only is it runway extra wide, you need more shoulders just in case you run off the runway, right? Blast pad is off the back end where they take off. When they fire up and they go full throttle, right? This is extra length out the back so that you aren't kicking up dust. And so you pave that, and that's the blast pad, right? So that's how wide the blast pad has to be. That's how long it has to be. It's a lot of length, right? When they run up those jets for that. So that's extra length before the takeoff point, right? For that. You've got an object-free area. You got to keep things, no light posts, no tall light posts. The little stubby ones are okay, obviously. But objects-free, no little houses, none of those, no facilities at all within 800 feet of the runway. So that's an object-free zone and so forth. And so let's look at some aircraft. Just give a little picture to what we were looking at here, right? This is, I'll hint, this is a Group 5 aircraft. So which one is this? Right. Should be fairly distinctive. That's the 747, right? And so that's in group, it says it's in 6, it's actually in 5. The 6 is the A380, right? But it is very large, right? And for a long time had been the largest aircraft out. They're almost, they continue to be retired after this recent shutdown. Even more of them are being retired fast. They're, most 747s are leaving passenger service. There's still a bunch in freight service. In fact, they're still building some new ones, the 747-8F for freight service. Much fewer than it used to, but that's still probably the last main use of the 747 and Air Force One. They're getting 2 new Air Force Ones, and those are on the 747-8 chassis, basically. through there. What's the maximum takeoff weight? What do you think this 747 weighs to take off? Right, 970,000 pounds. I think that's darn heavy. Right, that is when these first came out, and they weren't as heavy back when they first came out. The original versions of the 747, when they first came out, it was a big deal. Kind of like when the A380 came out, you had to redesign some airports to handle them, and you had to beef up the pavement and widen it and so forth. And see, even on this taxiway, like we're hanging out, right? We're way out over here with the grass on that, and so we're the width of those. They aren't the taxiways and the runways definitely don't cover the entire width of the plane if you take into account the wingspan on that. This is something I thought was interesting, is how much of the weight of that 970,000 pounds, how much of that is broken into which pieces, right? And what we find out is the empty weight of the plane is like 40% of the total weight is just the plane itself. Right? Interesting. For that, and that only this piece in here, cargo and passengers, is that's about 20%. The total weight of takeoff would be cargo and passengers, right? So it's like the live load if you were looking at structure stuff, right? That's small. I was really surprised. And then most of it's fuel, right? And look how much fuel we used for taxiing and takeoff, right? That's a lot, right? The maximum takeoff weight, 970,000 pounds. That's a lot. And this is what it's broken into, right? By kind of roughly by percentage, takeoff components on there. And if you're really interested in the 747, this is their most recent version, the 8, through that, which is larger than some of the earlier versions, right? The earliest one was from 1969 was a 747-100. The most of them in use these days are 747-400s, which were from the 1990s, basically, generation. They were still slightly smaller than this 800, which was early 2000s. They came out with the 800 series for that. And you can tell how old the 747 is, or what model it is how long this bubble on top is. The original ones only had a small second story, and it was mostly just to get the cockpit off of the same deck as the rest of the plane, so you could have passengers go all the way to the nose. That was their original concept. In successive generations of the 747, this bubble got bigger and extended back longer, and actually the entire plane got a little bit longer in successive generations through that. So the wingspan of the thing is 224 feet and 5 inches. And it's 250 feet and 2 inches long, right? The wingspan's almost as long as big as the entire length of the plane. I hadn't realized that before. So that's quite an aircraft. Right through that. Here's what the successive generations, if you're really interested in the 747, they started at 747-200. I wish I put the year here so we know what year these started. Like I say, most passenger aircraft that I read about getting retired nowadays are in the 747-400 generation. And then there are some in the 800 generation still flying, and they have newer engines and so forth. They're still not exactly fuel efficient. Right through there, you can see here's their wingspan, right? You can see how that wingspan has increased over the years until you get to the 747-8. Right? It's gone up quite a bit, right? It's an extra 30 feet since the 747-200. Right, and actually the tail got a little shorter. That's interesting. So they fit in the hangar better, I guess. Total length also gets longer, right? The 747-8s have gotten quite a bit longer through that, and wheelbase and so forth. Maximum takeoff weight went from 836,000 pounds to 987,000 pounds on that. So that's just a interesting piece about how the aircraft have changed over time. We're going to keep that in mind. The next time we're going to start in again on runways and look at how we design runways, how we align runways, and so forth, and move forward. Just keeping in mind a little bit on the aircraft operations side here, and just how big these things are. Right, that's 970,000 pounds. It's a lot coming through here, and then they're really big for that.